So nice to see everybody here today. Wonderful to come out in the cold, and I'm so happy to have this conversation.
Me too.
So I'm going to introduce the book for those of you who haven't read it yet, and then if you could read us a few pages.
Okay.
Okay. So, Entitlement, I'm going to just read this because I wrote it out. Entitlement is a comic novel centering on the subject of money, with offshoot themes of ownership, race, class, education, conservation, philanthropy, real estate, and work, and really more. I mean, it's sort of got it all. There are two main characters. Brooke Orr is a 33-year-old black Vassar graduate, raised in Brooklyn by a successful mother with input from her three best friends. She's restless and disgruntled after 9 years teaching at a charter school in the Bronx. Asher Jaffe is an 83-year-old Jewish billionaire who made a fortune in paper goods, but lost a daughter on 9/11, a tragedy that led him to decide to give away his fortune through his own philanthropic foundation. The book takes place in 2014 during the Obama administration, and it kind of just feels so far in the past.
Well, yeah.
It's so crazy.
Historical fiction.
Yeah. And it begins when Brooke is hired as an assistant at Asher's foundation. She quickly becomes his protege, and complications ensue. Okay.
Thank you. I was going to add, for the benefit of the audience, that Alice and I talked earlier this week, and she said, I'll do the synopsis for you, which to me is the greatest generosity, because for asking a writer to tell you what their book is about is really, it's very punishing. It's very punishing, and I hate explaining what this book is about. So now I don't have to. I'm going to read from early in the book where Brooke, the young black Vassar graduate, I should note that everyone in my books always goes to Vassar College. I don't know why. I think it's because it's a really beautiful word. She's explaining to her mother and her aunt who her new boss is. He founded Jaffe Office Supply. Brooke knew the whole story. Asher Jaffe had taken over his paternal uncle's stationery shop. Asher registered at Brooklyn College to avoid being sent to Seoul, left before getting a degree, and opened an outpost in the financial district, catering to office supply managers instead of Flatbush school kids in need of pencils and rubbers. In time, there were trucks, Jaffe in a jiffy. Advertising Age called this slogan one of the greatest of the 20th century. Its 6 syllables contain its entire promise. It was written by Asher Jaffe himself. I'm just going to pause to note that I wrote that slogan, and I do think it is an incredible slogan. I'm very, very proud of it. Asher bought out his uncle. He married a girl named Barbara and expanded into a catalog business. Asher was a seer. He saw the inevitability of the computer, and Jaffe could be relied on for magnetic tape. Asher was overachiever. He realized he was providing paper for others to print on, so expanded into that business. Asher was lucky. That subsidiary business of printing pages of mazes and word searches to be laid on the plastic trays of thousands of McDonald's nationwide made him a millionaire. Asher and Barbara became parents the day Kennedy was shot. Linda Jaffe died at her desk at Cantor Fitzgerald 38 years later. A whole life in the parentheses between American tragedies. By September 11, 2001, Asher was already a billionaire. Real estate, mostly. In the 1980s, he balked at expanding retail operations because his grandfather had taught him that it was wasteful to pay rent. By the magic of math, the malls he'd acquired in the name of thrift became more profitable than the ledgers and staplers still ferried about Chicago and San Francisco in yellow trucks emblazoned with the old-fashioned promise of a jiffy. His and Barbara's divorce occasioned a battle royale for custody of a Monet and the 81st Street townhouse. She got the painting, he got the mansion. He met Carol in one of those corporate photo ops men like him often had to endure. She was there to attest that Jaffe was an equal opportunity employer. That their first meeting was for the camera's benefit foreshadowed the tabloid's interest in the blonde from St. Paul, a gold digger who'd hit the mother lode, as they told it. Jaffe sold Jaffe before the recession destroyed the company. He was an informal economic advisor to the elder Bush's administration, invested, wisely, Microsoft, joined corporate boards, wrote a business book, paper thin, making $1 million out of nothing. I also wrote that title. And I also feel like that sounds like a book that you would see somebody reading on an airplane. Monitored his money and then resolved to give it all away. The man's own words about the death of his daughter were an early viral sensation for his friend Ariana's new publishing venture. Some actuary had sat down and done the math. Uncle Sam tendered $3 million of condolence. In the face of reality, Jaffe wrote, money means nothing. The question is how to make a life with meaning. So he was declaring it aloud. He would get rid of his money until he was left with only peace. There was disagreement on the internet as to Asher's net worth, but Brooke trusted Forbes, which put it around $3.7 billion.
Thank you so much. I want to say right now that there's going to be time for audience questions at the end, so be thinking them up as we speak. So I was wondering if you remember the first time you heard that a person could be a billionaire. Because I was trying to think about that, and I remember being aware of millionaires when I was young, but billionaires seem to have come along later.
Yeah, that's interesting. What a fucked up referendum on our culture that I can't actually think of it. Because it should be, like, it should be offensive to everybody who's paying attention to anything, that they exist. I'm sort of aware, this is like an accidentally really grandiose answer, but I'm sort of aware that in the Golden Bowl, Adam Verver is a billionaire. He's the first American billionaire.
That's funny, because I'm just about to reread that.
I think that's
I'll
right.
fact check you.
Yeah, you'll have to fact check that. I feel like that is my first sort of encounter with that figure on the page, but in the culture, I don't know. I mean,
because now they're just in
they're
your
everywhere.
faces.
They're everywhere. I mean,
It's like-
Michael Bloomberg was the mayor. I actually thought Michael Bloomberg was the mayor when this book was set because he was mayor for so long. But in fact, he wasn't. But they bloomed culturally for a while.
Yeah. And how did you make a decision that you wanted to write about a billionaire?
I like money. Like most Americans. I like the idea of somebody, I think that I'm very interested in the trappings of money and the ways in which it is a trap, and that a life that can seem really easy is in fact a really curtailed life. If you have known someone who is really rich, I know personally, not well, 2 people with $1 billion, and they are both kind of babies because they don't have to. They don't have to really do anything, and if you don't have to do anything, it seems like a fantasy, but I think it's actually a terrible way to live. You can't. I don't know. I don't know. So there's something about that contradiction that was of interest to me. The idea that Asher, who I'm writing about, he collects art in the book. Mm-hmm. So he can go and buy pretty much anything. And I have that fantasy, and many people do, that when you're in you go to Gagosian or something and you're like, God, wouldn't it be crazy if I could just buy this Richard Serra and put it in the backyard? And there are people who can do that. That seems like a kind of liberty. But those same people, if you took them to Target and were like, okay, do the self-checkout, they'd be like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah, I don't think they carry money, do they?
No. Yes, I also think that's the other. I think that's why really rich people seem so cheap, because they never have any money on them.
Yeah. I remember reading that the Beatles didn't carry money, and I was so shocked by that because I never thought of them as being really rich, but they were really rich, and they wanted to be really rich too.
Yeah.
Remember when John told Yoko, you got to make, I need this amount of money to feel safe, and she said, done. I'll go do it. I love that. So yeah.
Well, I like the honesty of that.
Yeah.
Because I think that that actually motivates a lot of life. And I think that that is defensible in many ways because you need to have the money to, you, it's not ignoble to want the money to like make sure your children have a good life.
No.
But then there is this point.
Where does it end?
That, yeah, exactly.
So you made him a philanthropist in the book. He's not, as far as you portray him, he's not an evil billionaire. He just seems to have like had a lot of business acumen and kept going and going and going until he had this a lot of money. But it doesn't seem to be at the center of his life, especially after his daughter dies. So how did you decide to write about philanthropy?
I wasn't that interested in writing about like an cartoonishly evil billionaire. You can like turn on the news and deal with that. It felt too easy, maybe in some ways. And I think you're right that even though he possesses all this money, he's weirdly undermotivated by it and like not altogether that interested in it. It sort of seems like he just happened into this situation where he possesses all this money and then has to discharge it. And in fact, I think what he becomes really committed to is the high of giving it away, which I also think is very prevalent in contemporary life. I think philanthropy, we are actually here today under like the aegis of philanthropy, right? Like you are all supposed to give $10 to the fund that will help school children be able to come here and use the internet, right? Like the social contract is now that like we're supposed to chip in for things. And I'm happy to give $10 or whatever to the friends of the library, but I'm less happy to have people, oh God, what's her name? Who was the secretary of Betsy DeVos? I'm less happy to have people like Betsy DeVos with billions of dollars at their disposal choosing to say, oh, well, this is how society should move, and I'm going to invest my money in this, in dismantling public education, and calling that philanthropy. Or one of the books that I read that was really influential when I was writing this book was Empire of Pain, which is a book a lot of people know and probably read about the Sackler family and the ways in which they use philanthropy. It really seems very plain to me, motivated by guilty conscience, you know.
It's funny you said that because the way you wrote about Asher's early money-making reminded me of the first Sackler, the great-grandfather, who was just like kind of a business genius when he was 15 years old. And, yeah, so interesting how that becomes that.
Over time, it can become. There's another excellent book called Gain by Richard Powers, which is sort of, I think it's based on Johnson & Johnson, but it's sort of telling the story of these young men in colonial America who make soap, and ultimately the thing that they build becomes this huge conglomeration that is giving everybody cancer. It's a really cheerful book. But yes, that sort of thing that like somebody with an idea, 100 years on, it can be totally corrupted by the influence of money.
So Asher and Brooke, they're really opposites in so many different ways. And interestingly, I thought that the opposite of billionaire is not poor. She's from an upper middle class background, educated. She's around people who have a lot of freedom moving around New York, and she's certainly exposed to everything too. And I thought that was an interesting choice to make those sort of the ends of the spectrum that you wanted to talk about in terms of looking at money in the book.
I'm so happy to hear you say that, because they are opposites in like demographically they're opposites. He's old and she's young. He's white and she's black. He's a man and she's a woman. And he is ultra rich and she is middle class. And those to me feel like the opposite. And I think it says it at one point, like the opposite of rich is not poor, it's middle class. because it's people who are sort of like indifferent to money and obsessed with money. And not that poor people are indifferent to money or not obsessed with money, but they're sort of, they exist at some remove from it. There's some resignation to it. And again, I think it was of interest to me, much as I didn't want him to just be like a bad guy billionaire, who made, like there's a reason he made his money selling paper, because it's funny. It's funnier than if he made his money selling missile defense systems, like that's not funny. And it's so funny to me that she is sort of held to be his opposite when she is from the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Like she's very rich by any sort of useful metric, but in the world that she enters, she's not at all.
I love that he made his early fortune on the McDonald's puzzles. I thought that was so funny. It really is. There's a lot of funny in this book.
Okay, this is another thing that Alice said to me when we emailed that made me so relieved, because I think this book is very funny, and
yeah, I do.
You thinking your own work is funny is like very stupid, and like it's really the proof is in the pudding. It's like, but I think that sometimes readers feel hesitation, like we have this sort of perception that books are serious and can't make you laugh, but I think like some of the most serious and weird books do that to you. And like I read East of Eden last summer. That is a hilarious book, and I did not know that it was so funny, and I did not know that it was so, it's also very sexy. Like I did not know that, like, obviously like funny and sexy and like vital are not things that, they don't expire. So in a way, that sort of vitality in a book that is a century old is sort of like still relevant today. But when you read a book, like you're reading it alone, you're not in, if you're in an audience, there's a different sense of like when you're allowed to laugh, like the thing teaches you when it's okay. But I don't know, I think it's like a lifetime of going to school. Makes you feel like, oh, books are serious, and you have to sort of sit up and pay attention and not chuckle. But I think I really aspire to write books that make you, like, that undermine that a little bit and let you laugh a little.
Yeah, I definitely, I've read all your books, and I think they all are comic. I mean, I would call
Alice is my publicist.
But do you think that's like a function of sort of tapping into the writers, like it's something about their tone? Like I could see where people could read this book as not funny or not comic because the themes are so big and heavy, and the characters are, you know, they're sincere in their lives. So, you know, sometimes you just catch it, I think.
I do, you're probably, I mean, because we know each other a little bit, you're probably more like attuned to like,
Well, I follow your Instagram.
the twists, right? Like you hear like the twist and the like, but I think that when writing about, actually I think humor is most useful on these subjects. Like one of the funniest books I've ever read in my life, one of the funniest books ever written is Paul Beatty's The Sellout, which is a very serious book about race in this country that is so funny. Like it is maybe the only book that I've ever laughed out loud at, because it is just so funny and it does not stop. In some ways it's like an exhausting book to read because it's so hilarious that you feel crazy. And in a way, that's the most suitable means, certainly for Beatty, to write about something as absurd as the way the way this country has handled the relations between blackness and whiteness. It's like, it's so appropriate. It is obviously like there are different approaches to that same subject, but I find that particular approach really liberating, you know, because I don't have an answer. There's no answer in this book about is it moral to have $1 billion? Probably not, but I don't know. Like, I can't answer it, but I can sort of make you laugh a little bit, I hope.
Yeah, I like that all those things the themes I mentioned in the beginning, they're raised, but they're not concluded in any way. They're just sort of raised for people to think about, or, you know, to have a little fun with, or see what these characters are going to do around them, because all of those pressures are on them.
And I don't know that a novel can answer those
I know,
questions.
it's really best not to.
Right? It is best not to.
Because
Like,
then you'd be like a priest or something, or a minister and do a sermon, right?
right, because also I'm not smart enough to have an answer about like, what is, you know, this book in some ways seems like it could be a Me Too book also, because it is about this very close relationship between a boss who is old and has a lot of power, and an employee who is young, and a woman and has considerably less power. I don't have anything interesting to say about that subject. You know, you should read like Rebecca Traister if you want to understand like somebody smart who's thinking about that stuff. But I can prod the reader into thinking about it, or remind the reader that this is like a very prevalent force in the culture, and that it affects the reader's life as much as it affects the lives depicted on the page. But I can't sort of offer a final word on it.
Well, it's interesting because I think when you read that setup, and how quickly she becomes his protege, and I want to talk about that in a minute, but I mean, obviously that possibility occurs to the reader right away, and you don't go there, which is, I mean, you don't really go there. You can read it in certain ways where you think maybe, but it's not what happens between them. What happens between them is so much more complicated and interesting, and it made me wonder which character you had first. Did you have Brooke or did you have Asher first? And did they develop with each other, or how did you do that? Because they're very attuned.
I had her first, but he really took over, and he sort of takes over the book. I hope that he is. I found him to be like really seductive, really charming, really funny, really like weird and alive. He's so annoying. He says like the most annoying things. He's so grandiose, but in a way that I found totally charming. And it is very strange to me. I mean, this is like something I can say to another writer of fiction that is harder to say to like someone who doesn't write. But it's weird how this thing that is a projection of your own psyche can feel like totally apart from you.
Oh, I know. It is weird, isn't it?
It's really bizarre.
It's hard to even explain in any way unless you do it yourself.
Well, it's a little like a functional mental illness, because basically you're like thinking about people who don't really exist for like 2.5 years.
And they're talking to you.
And yeah, you dream about them, and like I'll go to a restaurant and be like, God, you know, Asher would love this restaurant. But he doesn't exist. He's just somebody I made up. And then
Would he like this reading?
He would be he'd be like, oh, New Jersey. But then the book comes out and it's like they die. I feel completely liberated from them. So sometimes it's even hard to remember like those early days where you're negotiating with them.
It's very true how things just, when I've done things and people say, how did you write this part? I'm like, I can't, no memory, zero memory. It's very interesting. I want to talk about, I'm just going to read actually a little from the book, but because I want to talk about the scene when I think they really bond, which is when they go to Christie's. And they've been out at another meeting, and then Asher says, I'm thinking of buying my wife this Helen Frankenthaler for her birthday, so we're just going to pop by Christie's and take a look at it.
Very casual. Yeah.
Take a look at the painting. So this is from Brooke's point of view, when she's listening to Asher talk to the Christie's representative about the painting, and she's looking at the painting. Okay, the word for it was exhilarated, like she'd run a race. The damp awareness, the heart in her ears where it didn't belong. She didn't envy Asher the long European holiday, the stately car, the chauffeur, the rest of the stuff she couldn't quite imagine, fine bed linens, custom shoes, food more delicious than what she got to eat. Maybe his towels were softer, his soap more fragrant, his coffee more potent. But that transcendence could be bought, it could be sold. And most people knew nothing about these transactions. Brooke simply marveled. This was what money got you. This. Christ. I thought that was so great. And it's like to me it was like a very pivotal moment in the book, because that idea about transcendence, that, that is what makes her understand what wealth is. That you can actually buy something priceless, in real terms. I mean, there is a price put on it, but there really can't be in real terms. And I thought for him too, it's like his philanthropy is also transcendence. And it seemed to me like this is where they meet. This is where their souls kind of lock in this idea.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's probably most effective if a reader has an affinity for art. But I didn't want him to be buying her, like he could have gone to Harry Winston and said, we're gonna buy this $11 million bracelet, because people do that too. But that is, amazing, whatever, but that is like an object. That's not, I don't see transcendence in that. But the idea that some of the best of what human civilization has come up with can, and in fact does, belong to like 1,000 people is it's strange, and it's hard to kind of get your head around that.
It is.
Art is this thing that like should be removed from like the economy that is powered by dollars, but isn't. And I don't know, it's hard to know what to do with that. When I was researching this book, I did go to Christie's. I know a woman who was a curator at Christie's, and this is like one of the weirdest things that's ever happened to me, and this is like when I talk about the sort of functional mental illness of writing a novel. I went to Christie's to meet this woman, Sarah, in the summertime, which is like not the season, because everyone is in Rhode Island or Long Island, and there are private rooms in the downstairs of Christie's where a serious collector can go and see something. If I were a client of Sarah's, she would know that I like Helen Frankenthaler or Rothko or whatever, and say like, we have one, it's here, come and see it. And they take you past security into this sort of like network of hallways, and there are these big empty rooms that are like surgical theaters. They're so cold, the coldest rooms I've ever been in my life, with perfect lighting and like a really handsome man in a black suit who like turns the lights down for you, and doesn't say anything. He just sort of stands there. But they'll leave you alone in the room with this painting. But what the weird coincidence I'm describing is that I had already written this scene, and I went to see these rooms specifically, and Sarah took me into all of them, and they were all empty, except for the last one, which had a painting by Helen Frankenthaler in it, which was so weird. It's like, of all the things, that's really odd. But what's really odd is that when we went into the room, there was somebody in there looking at it, and it was just some guy. He might have been wearing like a t-shirt, and I was like, who are you? You're gonna buy this $11 million painting, and it will, like, I wasn't supposed to see this painting, and I was not allowed to photograph it. So I don't know who owned it, and I don't know the circumstances under which it was being sold. And I don't know who this guy was who was looking at it, whether he was gonna buy it, whether he was gonna buy it for someone else, whether he was like an agent to buy it. But so this painting was just gonna move from one person's guest bedroom to another person's guest bedroom. And I happened to be in the right place that I could see it, and that it could belong to me for 40 seconds. But that's weird. That's weird, and that is what like bottomless money can get you.
It is really weird. I mean, I've had those experiences too, where I've been at someone's house and they have like a painting that you can't even believe, and they're just, even in the bathroom,
Yeah.
That's
real money.
That's real money, yeah. And it's just kind of, it makes you feel like, yes, they are different. They're different.
Yeah.
Because just to be able to have that is just something that you can experience over a lot of time. Like, how long can you sit at a museum?
Right.
Right. But if it's in your dining room and it's year after year, you really see the painting completely differently, or not see
Or you don't see it at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. But so how did you decide to make that scene where she really understands this about wealth and have it be around a painting? I because I really thought that was such an important scene.
Well, there is a lot in the book about art, and I have a feeling about art, like a sort of like hard to articulate feeling. And it just seemed like a very useful tool. Because again, I guess if it were about a diamond bracelet, which can also be like a thing of beauty and an extraordinary thing to consider, her desire for that just feels like a more base desire.
Yeah, it's different.
Right, like wanting a nice sweater, which I also would love a nice sweater, and she does buy a nice sweater in the book.
Yeah.
And I love a nice
Yeah,
sweater. But there's something about painting that feels like it's just in some other sphere. It's like it's beyond the question of dollars and cents, even though the question of dollars and cents still pertains.
Also, she knows a lot about art. Like, she knows what
Right.
she's seeing.
Yeah.
Her mother actually has a little tiny teeny
Yeah.
Frankenthaler, which I love, and she doesn't tell him, which I think is so funny. But she wouldn't study a diamond bracelet at college, like you wouldn't.
Right.
You
I
know.
guess that's true. There's a cultural significance, like the idea that, and again that sort of goes back to philanthropy. Like philanthropy is not a bad thing. It is a good thing, generally. I suppose that rich people feel motivated to, I don't know. I don't know. You go to any museum in this country, and you see the name on the wall, the person who has built the museum, and you see like the name on the different work that the people who have donated this work, and it is good that that is their motivation, I suppose. That there's an impulse that I owned this Picasso, and now I'm going to share it with all of society. That's a good outcome, but it doesn't really answer the morality of like owning the Picasso in the first place. And I don't really know what again, the novelists don't have to answer questions actually happily. Like I don't have like there's a proposal in this book for like, oh here's how
Right.
society should function. But I do enjoy pointing out like the weird absurdities of the way that it does function.
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting. I remember the first time I moved, when I went to college, I went to Penn, so I was living in Philadelphia, and I just felt like West Philadelphia would not function without the Catholic Church. You know, they're there on the ground, they're doing so much work for people, but that's so hands-on, it's so like direct to the people, and I'm not saying the Catholic Church doesn't have the other end, because it does. You go to Vatican City, you see it. But the kind of philanthropy you're talking about, there's more of a fantasy element to it. It's like, and Brooke is sort of the go-between. She's like supposed to bring him the idea that is like the equivalent of living in the neighborhood, and which she does. She does bring him an idea, but it is really interesting how abstracted it can become, and how huge it can become.
It's not unlike expecting a billionaire to do the self-checkout at Target, right? It's like they can't actually, even though I do think there's a lot of research and reasoned argument that actually the best kind of philanthropy is simply to give people money. We seem as a society to have decided that that's not on the table, and prefer to sort of like give money to causes and institutions. I mean, this is not what this book is, but like there's a significant body of critique about that stuff. You give your money to a charity, and then the charity uses it to throw a party, and then the party is really fancy, and they have non-union labor, and they're serving like, whatever, on and on and on. It's like, what are the ethical untangling is like impossible.
Yeah, it's really, it really is a little much for our tiny brains. Okay, I'm going to read another little tiny bit. The book opens with the line, "It was a strange, sultry summer, the summer of the subway pricker, but Brooke Orr had decided not to let that interfere with the business of life in New York." And those of us who have read a lot of books will probably immediately recognize the opening line of The Bell Jar, which is, "It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, and I didn't know what I was doing in New York." And I loved the way you sort of fan fictioned that line and made Brooke, Brooke being much more decisive than the character presents herself in The Bell Jar. and then juxtaposing the subway pricker with the Rosenbergs. And I was really curious what, that homage that you were doing to the bell jar, if it goes further for you than that line, and also talk about the subway pricker, because I like having, a societal menace, out and about.
Yeah, he's like Jack the Ripper. The Bell Jar is an extraordinary book that I read when I was much younger, and then I reread the summer that I was, this second summer I was working on this book, and was so surprised by how accomplished it is.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's like a much better novel than I remembered it. I remembered liking it, but when I reread it, I was like, wow, this is a really good book, with an unbelievable first line. And to my sadness, queer has a very different connotation now, and I couldn't use the word queer because I really wanted to, but it just sounded wrong.
Yeah, it's gotten defined in a different
It just,
way.
yeah, language does that. It slips, it moves. But the Bell Jar is set in a sort of like intensely hot summer in New York City, as this book is. And to me, it was very simple. It was like, the Bell Jar is an excellent book about a woman in the Bell Jar, she's experiencing a medical crisis, which is definitely true, and certainly true for Plath. But there's also a way of understanding the Bell Jar as like the only logical response to being a woman in 1960s America was to lose your mind. And in this book, the only logical response to being aware of how money works in 2014 is also to lose your mind. So that's why I stole it, and I hope Sylvia Plath doesn't haunt me. And the subway pricker is this bad guy who may or may not exist, who may or may not be injecting women, with something unknown on the subway. It's happened like 4 times. And I liked the idea of this sort of like panic, this thing that you would hear about on NPR. It kind of reminded me of, it's like in disaster movies where they're like, oh, there's a rare virus, Just the idea that there's like something coming, this bad guy is out there, and that he's attacking women specifically. And on the subway, which is sort of like a great democratic space in New York City, you see, speaking of Michael Bloomberg, I've seen Michael Bloomberg on the subway, like, billionaires take the subway too because it's easier, and just the idea that like, there's menace helped do something to the atmosphere of the book, I thought.
It's a funny word too.
It is also a hilarious word.
So Brooke has sort of a cousin, Kim, who she's grown up with, the daughter of one of the other friends, the mother's friends. And Kim has enough money not to have to work. She's not a billionaire, but she's in that, next level to.
My father had polo horses, so if you have polo horses,
Yeah.
your kids probably don't need to work.
Right, and she buys herself an apartment, and when she's looking at the apartment, she invites Brooke along for this little jaunt, and the topic of getting an apartment and owning an apartment sort of takes over Brooke's mind in like such a huge way. And it also is very funny because if you live in New York, of course, like thinking about real estate, and it's true in Montclair too, by the way, but thinking about real estate and can you get what you want and all of that is really key. But it's so interesting because she says she doesn't want to marry. She wants to be independent. She wants to make her way, but she also wants an apartment that she can't afford. But somehow she thinks it'll happen,
That's the American dream. That's literally right? That caused the last financial crisis in this country. I want something that I cannot afford.
Yeah.
So so the economy will bend to accommodate that until it breaks. I mean, as a gay man, this is like the closest I get to caring about sports. So writing about real estate that was very easy for me. But it's also like, it is sort of like, as you say, like in Montclair, in New York City, it's like a cultural, it's a subcultural preoccupation. And it's also deeply, sometimes I think it's like an interesting thought exercise to think about the things that preoccupy you and then walk it back and realize the extent to which they've been instilled in your brain. It's a very unsettling thing, because I want a lot of stuff, because I'm an American, and because I have a phone that if I talk to my husband about how I want a Volvo, then the phone will listen and be like, you should buy a Volvo today, right? The idea of like home ownership being connected to American selfhood is so much bigger than anybody that you cannot fault people for like you know, what's the verb? I don't even know. Like so closely associating those two things. And feeling a failure if you can't. And it's sort of, you know, and it goes from there. It's like if you're a surgeon and you live in Montclair and you don't have a fourth bedroom, you may feel yourself a failure. And that is like it's not like laughable, even though it's very funny, because you're just sort of, it's what has been fed into you your whole life. Like it's just the story you've been raised on. There's a reason, in my last book I wrote about, they go to the grocery store at the beginning of the book and she buys all these like things, and a lot of readers were like, oh my god, I buy all those things. I was like, yeah, because you're like me, you're like a middle class asshole. So of course you buy the same things. Like, yes, I also, that's just the things I buy when I go to the grocery store. And you do, and one of my favorite things actually when I'm at the grocery store is to look at what other people are buying. Because it is like this weird exercise in autobiography. You're like, well, this is the person I am. I bought these recycled paper coffee filters because I'm a good person. And I paid 50 cents more for them, but I'm good, you know? And I think that homeownership in many ways functions the same way.
Well, that's interesting because Brooke thinks she is a good person. I mean, that's part of.
Do you think she's a bad person, Alice?
What?
Do you think she's a bad person?
No, I didn't. I did not think she was a bad person. I thought exactly what you just said. Like she had the influence of her mother thinking that her job at the charter school was beneath her. She has this cousin who's like a sister, really. I mean, it's not even a real cousin, but
yeah,
who's rich, and then she's working for Asher, who's telling her that she is entitled to live a good life. So she's getting messages, and you know, she's already 33, so she's gotten a ton of messages already. So, you know, I did not blame her for any of her actions. I was just really interested to see like where her own will came into it and where the societal influences came in. And I thought you balanced those things really well. Because you get choices to make.
And it's a question I ask of myself all the time. Like, why do I want the things that I want?
What do you want most?
Right now?
Yeah. I mean, not like in this room.
Not in this room. Okay, well, I really want this bag. It's really expensive. It's like crazy expensive. And
let's all pull.
I have friends of the library. I showed it to my husband, and he was like, what are you talking about? Have you lost your mind? I was like, I think I have lost my mind. Like, but you want things that are that you, I don't know. It's like you feel that it reflects some version of the self that you could be, and you recognize it mostly as like ridiculous. But you may actually pursue it, and you may actually spend that money, and find that 2 weeks later you're like, well, now I need these shoes, right? Like it's not really, it's like it never concludes because we live that's the water we swim in this country. You can't leave the house without spending money.
There's also like an aspect to it. I mean, I really relate to that because, I mean, we're all affected to it. We're all affected by it. But I showed my husband a necklace I wanted, and he said, but you have that exact necklace. And I said, it's not exactly. It's just a little different. And then I thought, I'm an asshole.
But I mean, it's so much more, like, and there's a lot in this book too about that, about want and need, and words that I learned when I worked in advertising that are very like powerful categories that are being sold to all of us constantly. And I just don't think, I think it's mostly beneath our notice, or we're sort of vaguely aware that we are being preyed upon, or that we are sort of a cog in a larger machine, but we're sort of mostly at peace with it. Unless you're the kind of person who's like, I make my own toothpaste, and I just buy like, I go to the co-op and I buy like baking soda, soup it to the thing, mix it with like lavender oil. Like, I'm not that kind of person. So I'm like, oh, I buy this toothpaste, and that's the person I am. And that really is the person I am as like a data point, and that's the only value most citizens have in the culture that we live in, which is really disturbing, but I think it's also true.
What about the title? Entitlement. It's a provocative title, and it kind of casts a way of thinking about everybody when you're reading about them. Like, what do they feel entitled to, and how and why? I thought it was a really great title.
Thank you. It was very. I find it very difficult to name a book. I don't know if you have a problem.
Yeah,
like,
I do.
It's like, I don't know why it's so, because it's sort of like if you named your child after 3 years of raising them. You were like, oh, this is the name that encompasses this mess that you are. Which is not how it works. If you name your child and you're like, oh, have you met this expectation that this name established for you? This book had a lot of different titles. The reason Entitlement, the reason I liked it is that it describes an attitude, and it's a word that you hear a lot now. People love, especially like one generation really likes to talk about another generation as entitled. That's like a very big, that's big in the culture. But I liked it because entitlement also is a policy word for describing welfare programs. So we talk about like entitlements to food or housing, for example, which is funny because Social Security, exactly. But it's funny that we use that word, that language, but don't actually culturally have enshrined rights to healthcare or food or housing. So it's like we've done it in the language, but not in reality, which seems very American also.
Were you a child writer? I'm guessing you were a child writer.
It's embarrassingly.
Somehow I guess that. So how did you stick with, like, how did you go from there to here?
Well, okay,
all the
so
other options?
I should have brought it because it's sitting in the back, but I could embarrass Alice by showing her the copy of In the Gloaming that I bought that book came out when I was 16 years old, and I bought that book when I was 16 years old. So that tells you what kind of child I was, first of all. I was that kind of kid who was reading The New Yorker and like buying short story collections, and it is funny to me that 30 years later I would be sitting on stage with you. Like, that's funny. I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel like writing is like, I'm using all these like negative sounding metaphors. I said it's like mental illness. It's also kind of like addiction.
Yeah.
It's like a habit that is ingrained from a very early age. And it seems related to an impulse to read a lot, or to like think. To me, it's like also like play. Like there's a point where you stop playing with toys and you start just thinking.
I don't think you keep going if you
right?
if it's not play.
Right. Well, there's no money in it, so I don't know why you would keep going. If it was fun, right? Like if it wasn't
you've
fun.
got a little money out of it, haven't you?
From making a movie.
Oh, you got the money from the movie, not from the books.
No one makes money writing books except for like the worst writers in America.
Oh.
Yeah. No, I love Stephen King actually.
Okay. I got like a million more questions, but I'm sure you all do too.
It's very embarrassing when no one asks questions, so.
Well, I got plenty more, so. Yeah, please come up and ask your questions.
Oh, what a good friend.
I think we all want to know what's the bag.
Yeah, and what does it cost?
It's too embarrassing. It's $4,000. I'm not gonna buy a $4,000.
Women's bags are like, there are a lot of bags that are more than that.
the culture.
Hi, so I haven't read the book yet, but I will. And it's a question of the philanthropy end of it. It sounded like it was more of the give to museums kind of philanthropy. So I wondered, I mean, does she bring in any kind of social programs or anything like that? It's like, how did she introduce him to philanthropy?
She does. She does bring him something that is sort of related to art, but is not about like big art institutions, because he sort of charged her with that specifically. He said like, "Oh, bring me something like that." And again, like I value philanthropy, but I guess I sort of value it when it aligns with myself politically, and that's sort of like the weird problem of philanthropy, because there aren't like, I'm sure there are